Welcome to The Right Angle, the podcast that's all things English and fantasy. Hi, I'm Autumn.
And I'm Abby. Last week, we covered what the landscape of fantasy looks like today, particularly online. Today, we're tracing the history of fantasy, from ancient monsters to modern blockbusters.
We'll look at how fantasy wasn't always a genre, how it slowly found its identity, and how it became one of the most popular forms of storytelling today.
To help us explore that history, we're joined by Dr. Megan Hartman, a professor of English. She's an expert in medieval literature and poetics, with a special focus on Old English and Old Norse texts.
Basically, she knows Beowulf better than anyone we know, and she also teaches courses on fantasy and speculative fiction, so she bridges the gap between old epics and the books we read today.
Dr. Hartman, we're so excited to have you today.
Thank you. I'm really psyched to be here. I was feeling very honored that you wanted me to come join you.
Today, we'll be looking at the history of fantasy from a chronological standpoint, starting all the way back with ancient and medieval literature. I'm especially excited for this because Dr. Hartman is very knowledgeable. So, Dr. Hartman, could you speak a little bit on ancient literature, particularly ancient English literature, and how it had fantastical elements all the way back then?
Yes. So when we're thinking about medieval literature, it's not as though there were a particular genre of fantasy where people were distinguishing between what is real and what is fantastic. In fact, there was a genre, hagiography, which is a religious genre. So these are the stories of bishops and martyrs and famous religious folks who would often perform miracles. And it was considered acceptable to have any old miracle in many of the hagiographies, because the idea was it doesn't really matter what exactly this saint or this martyr did. It's representative of what is happening by just the general things that we can see that are these miracles that show what was happening and what folks were able to do. And so you see that also kind of that idea translating into other stories, so that historical texts such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People has a lot of these same miracles throughout it, even though that's something that we wouldn't consider a historical text. And at the same time, then you also get stories about monsters and dragons and other things that we would consider fantastical that were kind of a part of the culture and just got woven in together with stories that maybe were considered mythological, maybe were considered historical. The distinction wasn't necessarily drawn.
For our listeners who may not have as much of a background regarding medieval literature, do you think you could outline really quickly how literature looked back then, what published works looked like, and how stories were spread, just so they have that context?
That's a really good question. So to give a little context, I study mostly Northern Europe when it comes to medieval literature. So that's England and Scandinavia primarily, a little bit also into Scotland and Ireland. We see some of the same trends on the continent in terms of France and Germany. And then, of course, the medieval period is far beyond Europe at this time. So just want to specify that most of what I am talking about is a particular version of medieval literature, and there is a lot of variation out there. But in terms of the kind of early Germanic epics, texts like Beowulf or Volsunga Saga, these would be texts that the stories themselves and the ideas, the legends would have been passed down for a long time orally. And some of the sagas, which were written in Iceland, are prose, but most of the vernacular texts that we have, the texts that were written in the language of the people in England, those were all poetry. So they're passed down orally. These poets, In Old English, they're called shopes. The shope would have a technique for composing a poem on the spot. And they would be familiar with the techniques and familiar with the stories. And then at the moment when they are telling the story, then they could speak in this way, using this poetic diction and this poetic technique to tell the story that they know as a poem. So this would have been happening for a very long time, and then ultimately England becomes Christianized. And with Christianity comes writing as a new technology. That before that, the people had runes that they could carve, and they would carve these on rune sticks or on stone, but we don't have any kind of large texts. And so now we're getting manuscripts and the Roman alphabet, and that's when things really started to get written down. So then some of these poems would be composed and written. This also means that the poets who are composing them are now Christian. So you see Christianity kind of woven in to the stories in a poem like Beowulf, where the poem who composed it is relying on some of these older stories, but also on his newer Christian ideas to craft the poem that he is writing. And so we have not a huge number, but a fair number of these poems in Old English that are vernacular poems that have sort of a combination of these elements, which contrasts a little bit with what we're seeing in Iceland and other parts of Scandinavia, where they really, even after they were Christianized, they maintained more of a connection to the older mythology as stories that they wanted to retell. So you see more examples of some poems that were ultimately written down that relate to these mythologies, as well as legendary sagas that were composed as prose that included these elements such as dragon slaying and a boy who was born without bones and would be carried into battle but could nevertheless fight very fiercely. So you have that, but then even in Iceland, where they're telling stories of the family sagas, stories that are things that are happening within remembered history and written history, you're seeing examples of draugr, the essentially Icelandic ghosts, which are a little closer to zombies. So they've got kind of the qualities of a ghost, that they haunt you, but then they're very corporeal. And so even though it's maybe a little bit more historical, a little bit more realistic, some of those more fantastical elements are still present in those stories. And then in England, we ultimately kind of move away from some of those Germanic stories later in the Middle Ages, and we start getting more romance stories, stories of King Arthur and Charlemagne, and that gets into a lot of epic battles where knights are fighting evil forces. And again, sometimes referencing very historical events. Charlemagne was someone that we can trace historically, but amid those historical events, there are some more fantastic things going on.
It's so interesting to hear how different literature was back then, yet how many things I recognized from it that exist today. I mean, this is going to sound really nerdy, but something that stuck out to me, I'm going to say this wrong, but the draugr you mentioned.
Oh, that's right.
I think the writers in Skyrim used that.
Ooh, cool.
It sounded very similar to how they appear in the game. They're kind of these like zombie-like spirits that are basically ghosts, but like have a body. So it's really cool to see sort of how, even though this literature existed a very long time ago and was mostly oral as opposed to written, it still kind of permeates through culture today. So I guess my question is, how do you see works like Beowulf and those romances such as Arthur and Charlemagne, how do you see those shaping the foundation of what we now think as fantasy?
I think there are a lot of different ways that we can see that happening. So I'll try to organize this into 3 main ideas. First, we have stories like Beowulf, and the Volsunga saga gives the story of Sigurd, who is a dragon slayer and one of the major heroes in Old Norse culture, or even the Song of Roland as another epic where you have Roland, the greatest of Charlemagne's knights, holding off an army to the point that everyone is slain, but no one can slay him because he is so strong and so powerful. And then ultimately he recognizes that he needs to call for reinforcements, and so he blows this horn, the Oliphant, and calls reinforcements, but has to blow it so hard and so strongly that he sort of bursts himself and is slain by the calling of the reinforcements, which ultimately saves the day. So all of these stories, you're getting these epic heroes, these heroes that are bigger than life. They're stronger than everyone else. They are more powerful, more honorable, and they are the ones who can stand between society and those dark forces that are threatening society in some ways. And I think that idea of these heroes who can kind of be that representation of everything that's good about society is something that is a very powerful aspect of fantasy. I think that's something that people like to read about. They like to have that feeling of strength and empowerment as they see that character do what no one else is able to do. At the same time, though, we don't necessarily like those stories where the good guy is just always good, is always powerful. I think you see this in a lot of Beowulf adaptations. When you look at the movies that have come out more recently, they don't like to stick to the story. They like to make Grendel somehow the fault of the humans, and they like to show Beowulf not just able to beat Grendel easily, not perfect in all of his decisions. So there's this tendency to adapt Beowulf in that way. And so I think that's where we see more of the influence of the romances. The romance stories have heroes who are not necessarily perfect, and oftentimes they come with a quest. And so the hero starts out struggling, and they go on this quest, and through the course of the quest, they are able to grow and learn more. And then by the end of the story, they can do what they need to do, what they started out trying to do. And so that growth has definitely been something that has become more important. And I think that's part of the reason why the quest narrative for a very long time was a major narrative within fantasy. More recently, though, I think we're also seeing a trend that's sort of similar to what you're seeing with Skyrim. We had these stories that had these fantastic elements, and then they get adapted into this genre that becomes fantasy, and then they become kind of tropes of fantasy. And now I think people are looking back to those medieval sources and saying, hey, I want to get back more to those roots. What are some of the specific things that we see there that are maybe outside of, the wizard casting fireball and those sorts of things that have become maybe a little bit more common? And what are some of the things that we can pull directly from Old Norse sagas or from Beowulf or from the Nibelungenlied, these stories that are kind of the origin, but we've maybe moved away from as time went on.
So, moving on from medieval literature a little bit, do you think you could catch our listeners up to speed of what happened in perhaps, this is a big range to cover, but what happened in fantastical literature or literature that just happened to have fantasy elements post the medieval era all the way up until the early 1900s?
Yes, that is a big question. I think that we see a shift away in some ways from these more fantastic elements. So, for a time, say early modern period, they're certainly still being used. We have texts like The Fairy Queen, which is a religious allegory, but has monsters, includes Arthur as a prince, and so is using those same sorts of elements. Similarly, Shakespeare has inspiration from medieval texts, such as Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which is one of those historical texts I talk about that really kind of conflates what is the actual history in the kings and what is the fantasy that we have about them. And so Shakespeare's drawing on those. And so we're always going to see stories like that that are using some of those medieval stories. There's always been a fascination with the medieval and kind of thinking back to that time as this older time that is magical in some ways. So even much after that, with Tennyson and the Idylls of the King, we can see that goal to kind of look back and therefore include the fantastic elements in there. At the same time, we also start seeing other authors really veering away from that, and fiction in particular tends to take a much more realistic kind of bent. But nevertheless, there are some stories that still have elements that are somehow not based in reality. One of the most famous would be Frankenstein. Mary Shelley, for having written the story, which was sort of written as a ghost story, has often been called the mother of science fiction, because she is doing that combination of thinking about science and putting science into a context where it can do something that we don't currently have the ability to do. And so it's kind of a new way of thinking about the fantastic. And we see some of the same things with other authors, such as Lewis Carroll, who is writing an absurd story with Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass that still kind of gets at some of the same concepts that maybe we saw in older stories, that really embraced and believed in some of these magical elements, but without necessarily, Tennyson is directly referring back to them. So Carroll is doing it in a different way, bringing in different sort of imaginative ideas that he is coming up with. And so that these different moves are kind of opening up new options for ways to incorporate these sorts of elements.
So at this point, fantasy still isn't a genre yet, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. How do you think it started to establish itself as a recognizable genre?
Like a lot of things, it wasn't something that happened all at once. There was no one who decided, or a group of people who said, hey, I think it's really cool to have stories with wizards and dragons and magic. Let's start writing like that. But you start getting a larger market for what we now call genre fiction. Stories that aren't just presenting some sort of story that is relating to real life and challenges and difficulties and conflicts between people that we kind of think of as literature. And probably partly because people have a little bit more disposable income, probably partly because we have more technologies that allow us to produce some of these stories cheaply. We get these pulp fiction magazines. And these magazines allow people to explore these more popular stories that maybe they're very much for fun. They're the kinds of stories that I think of sometimes today as my book candy. Like, there are books that I know are not the best written in the world, that I know are a little repetitive and maybe not the most creative, but they've got fun characters and I like reading them. And I think a lot of these pulp fiction magazines, which I have not read a lot of myself, but I'm under the impression that they're kind of like that. And it's many different genres that they're exploring. There's a lot of science fiction. Horror is also really common there. But that's where we start to get what is referred to as the sword and sorcery fantasy. So it's not the kind of high epic tales that we start seeing a little bit more later, but you have things like Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. And their first story, two-sought adventure, they meet up. I believe they beat each other up when they first meet, but they ultimately decide that they can work together, and they go on these adventures where they're seeking treasure and they're stealing things, and there's, brawls and fights and all sorts of fun stuff. And so it's a lot of stories like that that are incorporating things like treasures that have magical properties and wizards who can cast spells. And so as you're getting more authors who are writing stories like that, and people who are reading these magazines and who are starting to get into them and making those stories popular, and which then of course encourages more authors to write them, that's where you start getting this a little bit more maybe solidified. We're not all the way to organized yet, but maybe solidified as a genre that people can think about.
Yeah, definitely. I know you mentioned that at this point we weren't two big epics yet.
Right.
It's kind of been the elephant in the room. Do you want to talk about how fantasy kind of transitioned into those bigger epics and a very big influence on what fantasy would become later?
I somehow think you are referring to Tolkien.
Indeed.
So Tolkien is an author that, well, I would say we all know and love, but I think he can be a little controversial. I know some people who are proud of the fact that they are against some of the things that he has done, but I certainly love Tolkien, and I have enjoyed reading his books, and I think every single fantasy course I have taught has included mostly The Hobbit. And it's interesting to think about kind of how he goes about this, because I think in a lot of ways the audience and the opening for this fantasy comes from these pulp fiction magazines where people are getting interested in this sort of magical adventures. But they are also so far from what Tolkien did. And this is largely because Tolkien professionally wasn't originally an author. He was a scholar. He had a PhD and was a professor of medieval literature and languages. So he has translations of Beowulf and other medieval texts, and he taught courses in these things, and he could read Old English and Old Norse in addition to Latin and Greek. And he probably would have identified himself as a philologist, someone who studies literature through the lens of language and can think about, looking at these older languages, studying them, understanding them, and using that to then understand the literature that is written in them. And that, of course, is a big part of where the whole Lord of the Rings saga started, that he started creating languages. And in creating languages, he's creating a world, and then in creating a world, he's creating something that he can tell stories in. So the origin then of these stories really harkens back much more to the Old English and Old Norse texts that we were talking about earlier, to the point where the first semester I ever studied Old Norse, I then was listening to a book on tape, and yes, I do actually mean a book on tape. It was a cassette tape, and it was Return of the King, and I'm listening to just the diction Tolkien is using, the words that he is choosing, and these are the same words that are the most common in some of the Old Norse texts that I had just been translating, and the same sort of sentence structure in some ways. So you can see how he's really, especially once we get to Return of the King, which has that kind of grand epic finale feeling to it. But when we're getting there, he's really relying on that same sort of feeling that you get in these earlier texts. And you can see that with his characters as well. That you have a character like Aragorn, who is a king in exile, but he carries the broken sword because he knows that he is the successor to this grand tradition, and he has a responsibility to carry that on, to protect his people, and to ultimately have this sword reforged and to become the King of Gondor if that is what becomes necessary. And again, it's something that distinguishes Tolkien in some ways from kind of common ideas about what a story should be. If you compare his characters to the characters in the movies, there's some big differences that really center around the idea of epic hero versus romance hero. That in the movies, Aragorn refuses to take up the sword, and he has to grow into that ability. Frodo, they make him a much younger character, and he's sort of constantly in fear and making the wrong decisions and doesn't know what to do. Whereas in the books, we see Frodo's wisdom that he has gained from talking with and visiting with the elves, and we see Aragorn kind of constantly doing the right thing and taking this responsibility. And so you get then a story that's very different from Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, where, you know, they're brawling and stealing and having shenanigans, and much more similar to Beowulf. But it's something that took hold, I think, of a lot of people who enjoyed those more fantastic stories, but maybe also admired those heroes who you could really get behind. Maybe not relate to as well, but you can feel empowered by and admire.
So, a lot of people who know a lot about fantasy credit Tolkien with creating the modern fantasy blueprint, or with having a great deal of influence in fantasy today. So, you've kind of already touched on it, but what do you think it was about his work that made such a lasting impact?
I think pulling back in some of these medieval stories, or at least medieval ideas and attitudes, was definitely a big part of it. And bringing in a little bit more grandeur, I think, was another. That the stories felt like they had more weight. We're not looking for an awesome treasure. We are looking to save the world from an evil that is irredeemable and that will destroy everything that is good if we are unable to do this. And I think it's also significant that with this kind of quest narrative that he's creating, we have a band of people, well, a band of men who are going on this quest, and they're doing it together. Conan the Barbarian, he's a lot by himself. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, you got the two of them. But now we have this group where you've got the wizard and the noble king in hiding, and, you know, another human warrior prince type who is awesome but maybe not quite as awesome, and an elf and a dwarf, and your everyman kind of character, your hobbits who love second breakfast and wear waistcoats and are maybe someone that you could see yourself. So it becomes this group that is amazing, but that you could join along with Merry and Pippin, because they're just guys who happen to, you know, be willing to support their cousins. And so it's kind of grander and bigger and more diverse and interesting, while at the same time kind of leaving this space open for other people to join in.
I think you hit the nail on the head completely there. I think the group is really a big thing that drove people's interest, because I think everyone has a character in that group that they find themselves the most drawn to.
And that's really a blueprint that you can kind of trace then. So another important author who followed Tolkien is Terry Brooks. And you look at his first book, The Sword of Shannara, that was so popular. Well, Alanon, a druid, not a wizard, but a druid, goes to a little village where people don't really think about or believe in magic so much, and find kind of a chosen one, along with his adopted brother, who are just living a normal farmer's life. And he tells them that they have to go on this quest, and they are joined by the prince of the kingdom, who is, kind of going anonymous, and an elf, and a dwarf, and another prince. And, you can almost match the characters up, character for character, as you think about who makes this group. And then they go on the quest, and they have to fight this ultimate evil. I remember when I was a kid and writing all sorts of stories, it never even occurred to me not to write a story with a band of people going on a quest. Like, that's what you do. That's what a fantasy story is. And you see it in David's Eddings, the Belgariad. You see it in the early Dragonlance Chronicles, where a group kind of randomly comes together at this inn from all sorts of different parts of the world, but then they form up together and are able to go on a quest where they are fighting against the goddess of evil, essentially. And so it takes all of these different iterations, and you see some changes start to work their way in. So while you can match up almost one for one with Terry Brooks in the Dragonlance Chronicles, you have a couple women in the party. And so we start to see differences, but there's still a lot that's kind of drawing from these same ideas and using that pattern in a way that I think is really can hit on emotions that people are wanting to feel when they are reading these books for their entertainment and fun, and trying to, maybe think about a different sort of option for living.
I think we've already kind of touched on it, but a lot of these patterns you've been talking about, Tolkien kind of bleeding into the fantasy that came after, really made me think of the 80s and 90s fantasy boom, but specifically the rise of D&D. D&D being something that we've talked about on this podcast a lot. How do you think what Tolkien did fed into the rise of fantasy in the 80s and 90s, specifically D&D? And then, in addition to that, how do you think fantasy and gaming culture, such as D&D, fed into fantasy that followed?
I love the way that you're thinking of that in this very sort of iterative process where the one enforces the other, because I think that is so accurate in terms of how things tend to develop. You can see just kind of the core of D&D really following from Tolkien. What do? Well, you pick a class and pick a race and have a group of people who all do that, and so then you're getting together a band of different sorts of people or beings, they're not all humans, who then are going to go on a quest that the DM creates. And so the concept that D&D kind of starts with is very much where Tolkien started and that path that he kind of set us on. But then you're getting these D&D stories that start to influence other novels that are written. So when you think about the Forgotten Realms books, there are crossovers where Forgotten Realms then can become a world that you can campaign in D&D, and there are computer games that are created that have kind of the D&D method to them, but take place in a Forgotten Realms world. And that then means that more stories that were made in Forgotten Realms can then bleed back into D&D. Oh, well, now we can have Harper characters who are part of this group that travel around to do good. And we can start adding in some of the other concepts that some of these authors are exploring. And of course, D&D itself allows for so much creativity because it's all about the people who are playing and what they want to do to create the story. So it can go in so many different directions. And in order to play, you have to be creative, and you've got to be willing and wanting to think about new ways that you can use some of these ideas. Some of the people who do that then are some of the new creative minds that go on to create fantasy stories, and they're doing it based on what has come before, but also based on how they're able to change things up a little bit. And so I think having more people interested in this type of story, and really a diverse group of people interested in this type of story, has allowed for a lot of different mindsets and perspectives to get put into the mix, which then allows for a lot of variation coming out of it.
I know you mentioned that fantasy, it kind of seems like this cyclical thing. A new thing comes out of the old thing, and then that new thing influences the next thing, and that just continues past D&D and a lot of the epic fantasy we were seeing in the 80s and 90s. How do you see that cycle continuing up until today?
I think one of the biggest things is kind of a slow move away from the quest. Not that we've abandoned that narrative, because of course that is still a very common narrative that we see in a lot of modern texts. But as we're bringing in some of those additional voices, we're starting to see more ways that a fantasy story can be realized. So you see some that have a focus on, the court and the court intrigue and politics as an extra kind of version of what can make these medieval stories interesting. Of course, we see a lot more women where we didn't see women before, and that's been really interesting too, because one author that I really like is Tamara Pierce, who does a lot of sort of YA middle grade type books, and one of which I just discovered has been banned. And since it's banned Books Weeks, that's something even more of a reason that you can think to read some Tamara Pierce books. But in her books, the main character is always a woman, or really a girl at the start of the book. And in the first book, it's this character is a squire, and she actually switches places with her brother so that she can become a squire, and she's in disguise as a boy. And kind of the way to become empowered as a woman is to break into what only men are able to do. And as Pierce continues and you get more books with different characters, you start seeing her move away from that model a little bit. Not that she sort of abandons that. She definitely still has that concept going on, and we see characters doing that, but we also see a little bit more respect for the idea of, or you could be more feminine, and it doesn't just have to be acting like a man in order to be a woman who is powerful in one of these fantasy worlds. So, that's sort of that iterative idea of, okay, we can start getting women in these roles, and then once they're there, how do we see that evolve? Another thing that we can see in Tolkien is that our characters are very privileged. They have resources, they are kind of the respected figures in the community, so they can stop and get help at waypoints along the way. They have the advantages that society provides them. And that really is very common. Think about that sometimes when you're reading some of these stories and they just always seem to have horses and tents and food. I mean, Tolkien gets into that a little bit, where they will lose their horses and the food gets washed away and how are we going to eat? But at least at the start of the journey, like, that's never a problem. You gear up. And then you start getting stories where it's like, okay, but what if you don't? What if you're having to have an adventure because you're thrown into it, but you don't have this privilege and you aren't allowed to, get whatever you want wherever you want it. And so that's when you start to see different kind of characters, and then that can lead to a space where more diversity is allowed. And now we're getting a lot more fantasy that's written not necessarily about King Arthur and medieval England, but we have Africa and China and Japan, or if not, those places, a fantasy realm that's based on those places. And so the more that we can kind of bring in different sorts of ideas, the more those ideas become part of this broader mosaic that can then get reconsidered and developed, that's really creating a much more diverse and I think much more interesting version of what fantasy can be.
I completely agree. I think it's so cool to see just how much fantasy has kind of flared out from Tolkien's era. And I think, similar to what you've said, I think a lot of people, especially now, are trying to be like the anti-Tolkien, like, oh, this is the cliche, so a lot of times it works. Sometimes it's like, okay, you're trying to not be Tolkien, but it's very cool to be able to trace all of these roots all the way back to, medieval Norse texts, to medieval English texts, and these oral stories that people were telling, and the romances that people were writing. And it's so cool to see that those stories from generations and generations and generations past still have elements that are showing up in the stories that we're writing today.
Well, we just wanted to say thank you so much for willing to come on this podcast and just inform us about the history of the fantasy genre, because I know I learned a lot through this conversation, and I imagine Abby did as well. And so I just want to say a big thank you to agreeing to be on here with us today.
Absolutely. I adore getting to nerd out with people who enjoy the same things I enjoy and who also know a lot about it. So it's been a great conversation.
Fantasy has come a long way. From oral traditions and myths to novels, pulp magazines, and global multimedia franchises.
But even through all of these different stages of the genre, it's always been about capturing wonder, adventure, and imagination.
Well, that's it from the right angle, where we know the real magic isn't just in the story, it's in those who write it too.
Until next time, write boldly, read unapologetically, and stay weird.